Good morning. Good morning to Nobel Forum and this press conference for the announcement of this year's Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. My name is Thomas Perlmann and I'm the Secretary of the Nobel Assembly. I will first read the announcement in Swedish, followed by English, and we will then present some background to the prize and open up for questions. Nobelförsamlingen vid Karolinska institutet har idag beslutat att Nobelpriset i fysiologi eller medicin år 2017 ska delas lika mellan Jeffrey C. Hall, Michael Rosbash och Michael W. Young för deras upptäckter av molekylära mekanismer som styr cirkadisk rytm. The Nobel Assembly at Karolinska Institutet has today decided to award the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine jointly to Jeffrey C. Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael W. Young for their discoveries of molecular mechanisms controlling the circadian rhythm. Here are the three laureates. Jeffrey Hall was born in New York and performed his seminal work at Brandeis University. He's now retired and lives in Cambridge in Boston. Michael Rosbash was born in Oklahoma City and performed his prize-winning studies also at Brandeis University, where he's still on the faculty. And finally, Michael Young was born in Miami and did his work at Rockefeller University in New York, where he also remains on the faculty. I will now describe the discoveries behind this year's award. So this year's prize concerns the circadian rhythm. The word circadian originates from the Latin word circa, meaning around, and dies, meaning day. But in a way, it is actually about astronomy. Ever since the emergence of life on Earth, about 4 billion years ago, evolving life forms had to adapt to the rotation of our planet. This ability to prepare for the regular daily fluctuations is crucial for all life forms. But how is this possible? This year's Nobel laureates have been studying this fundamental problem and solved the mystery of how an inner clock in most of our cells in our bodies can anticipate daily fluctuations between night and day to optimize our behavior and physiology. This existence of an inner clock was first described already in the 18th century. The French astronomer de Meuron studied the mimosa plant that opens its leaves towards the sun during day but closes at dusk. De Meuron asked what would happen if the plant was exposed to constant darkness. And he found that even then, for several days, the leaves continued to follow their regular 24-hour daily rhythm. In the 20th century, it was established that also other plants and animals, including rodents and humans, have their own biological clocks following the daily circadian rhythm. Studies of the clock in fruit flies show that many different behaviors are controlled by the clock. Fruit flies are really excellent model organisms for studies of genetics, and in the 1970s, a mutation that affected the fly's daily rhythm was identified. The mutated locus was called period. But how did the mutation affect the internal clock? This year's laureates, they wish to peek inside the clock and figure out how it actually works. A first breakthrough came in 1984 when Jeff Hall, in collaboration with Michael Rosbash and Michael Young working independently, were able to isolate the period gene. Now the scientists could begin to disentangle the cellular wheels and cogs of a clock machinery. Jeff Hall and Michael Rosbash showed that the period protein itself was cycling and peaked during night and was low during day. In 1990, they showed that the period mRNA also oscillated, as shown on this slide, and accumulated several hours before the period protein. These and other important observations led to a brilliant idea for how the clock works by a feedback control mechanism. The idea was shown to be correct, and in the next few slides, I will show how it actually works. When the period gene is active, period mRNA is made. The period mRNA is transported to the cell's cytoplasm, where period protein is made. When period protein accumulates, the protein moves into the cell's nucleus, where it blocks the activity of its own gene. When the gene is blocked, no more RNA can be made. Period protein levels will decrease, and the gene will no longer be blocked. And the production of mRNA can start all over again, and the cycle can continue. But it remained unclear how the period protein could accumulate in the nucleus to inhibit the gene. This problem was solved when Michael Young discovered a second gene called timeless that is also critical for the clock. This is shown in this experiment. The top diagram shows how period mRNA is cycling over several days in normal flies. The bottom diagram shows that the cycling was disrupted when the timeless gene had been inactivated. But how did the timeless protein affect the period gene? Additional experiments show that timeless protein bound to the period protein, and together they entered the cell nucleus, where they could inhibit the period gene. It was also critical to understand how the speed of the oscillations can be controlled. Michael Young identified yet another protein called double time, or DBT. This protein was shown to slow down the accumulation of the period protein, which explained how the oscillation can be adjusted to more closely match a 24-hour cycle. Jeff Hall and Michael Rosbash showed that two additional proteins, clock and cycle, activated the period gene in fruit flies. So, with all these groundbreaking discoveries by the three laureates, an elegant feedback control mechanism for the biological clock had finally been unraveled. We now recognize that biological clocks function by these same principles in other animals, including in ourselves, in humans. Most of our cells in our bodies have these clocks. Our inner clock adapts our physiology to the dramatically different phases of the day and regulates many critical functions such as behavior, hormone levels, sleep, body temperature, and metabolism. We do not feel well when there is a temporary mismatch between our external environment and the internal biological clock, for example, when we experience jet lag. Studies have also indicated that chronic misalignment between our lifestyles and the clock is associated with increased risk for various diseases. Since the paradigm-shifting discoveries by Hall, Rosbash, and Young, circadian biology has developed into a highly dynamic research field with vast implications for our health and well-being. Here they are again, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young. This is the end of the presentation, and I would now wish to present our expert panel, who would be happy to respond if there are questions. So, at the far end, we have Professor Julien Sirat, who is a member of the Nobel Committee. In center, we have Anna Wedell, who is the chair of the Nobel Committee. And on her side, we have Professor Carlos Ibanez, who is also a member of the Nobel Committee. So please, if there are any questions, please go ahead. There must be at least one question. Okay, please go ahead.
Have you already been in contact with the professors? Did you dare to call them in the middle of the night?
We are usually not afraid of calling them about this, and I was able to get hold of Michael Rosbash and Jeffrey Hall, but I haven't reached Michael Young. So they just got the news.
How did they respond?
I first got hold of Michael Rosbash and he was silent, and then he said, "You are kidding me." Is there any other question?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Please go ahead.
About the dynamics of this system. So if one were to change the cycle to like 6 hours instead of 24 hours for humans, for some reason, or chicken, they are being kept in very short cycles. What happens with this system? Does it adapt to very short?
I think I'll ask Anna to respond to that question.
Well, we know that there are, in rare cases, there are humans who have a little bit altered length of the period, not as you described 6 hours, but a little bit shorter, and they get sleep problems. We don't know of any drastic disruptions in humans of the clock. There are, of course, animal experiments, and if you disrupt the clock in animals, you will get effects on metabolism and on various physiological parameters. But in humans, it's not really possible to do those kinds of experiments.
But are there any treatments or possible treatments for sleep disorders that could be based on this finding?
Well, an obvious answer would be melatonin, which is a hormone that is secreted before we go to sleep, and that it can also be used to for those kinds of problems. And some people even use it for jet lag. And also, if you're blind, for instance, your rhythm will still be going, but it will be out of sync with or misaligned. It will be free running, since it will not be entrained by light. And then you can use similar compounds to melatonin to try to adjust them. Did you hear me?
Here's one question. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm from Chinese media, Green Post and China Radio International. My understanding of this prize is in physiology, right? So can you tell us how long have you, or how did you find them, and what is their contribution to mankind?
I didn't
Did
hear
you?
How we found them and their contribution.
I'll ask Carlos Ibanez to respond to that question.
How we found them. Our mechanism is based on nominations from different parts of the academic community and institutions, universities, other scientists. And then these scientists have been nominated by these other members of the academic community and research community. And then that's how we found them. Our work is directed by the nominations that we get. We are aware of interesting fields, but we can only follow up nominations from the scientific community. And then we investigate whether the discoveries merit this prize, and that's how we found them. The contribution to humankind is the discovery of a fundamental mechanism underlying very important aspects of physiology, how our cells can keep time. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, here's one question.
I've got one question. I'm Fred from China's National Xinhua News Agency. Regarding to this year's discovery, do you think this discovery by the scientists can solve the problems, especially that we encounter in the Nordic countries where you've got long, dark winter days, the people tend to have depression? And is this discovery actually shedding lights to solving the problem to boost, people's energy?
Could Julene
So I guess
answer?
the question was how this discovery might solve the problem of how people cope with extreme
Dark.
changes in darkness or sunlight. And I think what it can do is raise awareness to the importance of proper sleep hygiene and the importance of really making certain that we allow ourselves to, go to bed at an hour that's suitable. I guess for many of us, it's around, between 10 o'clock or so, even if the sun is shining on Midsummer Day. And it probably helps us to be aware of the fact that we need to be in a dark environment to get the best sleep. And that we shouldn't be afraid of using our alarm clock, even when it's the darkest times of the year. So I think what it can do is help raise awareness.
Okay, is there any else who is interested in asking a question?
Is it possible for you to say it in Swedish? Kan du prata svenska och förklara?
Det går bra. Så att frågor på svenska går bra också. Eller andra språk, om vi klarar det.
Kan ni förklara då texten på svenska?
Ja, alltså det skulle jag föredra att göra i intervju sen, men alltså det handlar ju om en inre biologisk klocka som man har känt till och som går oavsett om det är ljust eller mörkt, om det är dag eller natt. Den är inre, den går av sig självt. Den ställs rätt av yttre faktorer som ljus, men den fortsätter att gå och den påverkar väldigt mycket av vår fysiologi. Och de här forskarna har förstått mekanismen för hur den här klockan fungerar i våra celler. Klockan finns i nästan alla våra celler i kroppen och är väldigt viktig för väldigt många processer. Okay. If there are no more questions to ask, I know many of you are looking for interviews, so we can go ahead with that. So with that, I would like to close this conference and thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Man måste bygga på med en gång. Det geht auch online, aber das macht nichts. Ich schreibe nur einen Text. Ja, ne? Ich schreibe, genau. Genau. Ich werde den bearbeiten und ich werde den online stellen und wir werden den sozusagen ja, genau, aber morgen.
Professor Anna Wedell, Chair of the Nobel Committee, could you describe to us what is circadian rhythm?
So circadian, it derives from the Latin. So circa is around and day is day. And this is the daily rhythm we have to anticipate and adapt to the dramatically different conditions during day and night that arise from the rotation of the Earth.
So the three laureates, what problem have they solved?
So it had been known for a long time that there are diurnal or circadian rhythms, but how it worked wasn't unknown at all. And it was debated for a long time whether it was a response to external signals or something endogenous. And before they started their work, it was understood that it was endogenous, and it was even understood that single genes could influence the circadian rhythm, but nothing was known about the mechanism. And there were different hypotheses, but they found out the mechanism that controls the machinery of the clock.
So if we turn to the discovery, what were the key findings and who did what?
Yeah. So first of all, they used the fruit fly as a model system, and before their work, there had been a classic experiment by Benzer and Konopka. They had used the fruit fly to ask, can you identify mutants that arise due to mutations in single genes? So that was sort of a basis before our laureates started their work, and they took advantage of that because the gene wasn't known. There were mutant strains known who had long or short or no rhythm at all that were known to map to the same locus. So the laureates used these flies and went on to isolate the gene and to determine what gene it was, but that didn't prove the mechanism either. So what they then did was experiments to understand the function of the system by this gene and then several others that they did in sequential experiments.
And why is circadian rhythm important?
So we need the circadian clock to anticipate the daily changes, not only adapt but anticipate. So there are dramatically different conditions during day and night, and we need to be very active in the day, and other processes need to take place during night. And evolutionary, it's been a very great advantage to use the early critical light hours, minutes of the day. For instance, if you're hunting, you need to be active, or if you're hunted, you need to run and hide. So you need to be prepared and take advantage of and be one step before the environment. And that's why we need it.
And is this kind of clock? Is it in all our cells, or?
Well, we know that most of our cells have this clock, and we knew before these discoveries that there is a central clock in the brain that controls the rhythm, and then later it was found that we also have them in other parts of our body. But it's actually the mechanism that the laureates have elucidated. It's an autoregulatory, self-sustained, inhibitory feedback loop.
It's a bit complicated. If you should describe what they found, the actual what they are awarded for, in an accessible way, would it be a metaphor one could use? Or?
Metaphor, yes. Well, of course, the clock is a metaphor, easy, but the mechanism is a little bit difficult. But it's an oscillator. So you build up a substance, and then when the substance is there, it turns off its own production, and then it can start over again. So it becomes an oscillation. So a negative feedback of its own synthesis. That's the best I can do.
So it's a bit like an hourglass when the lower part is full of sand and it's time to turn around? Or?
Yeah, but an hourglass doesn't really shut off its own synthesis, so it's hard to find something similar, actually. So an oscillator, and the mechanism for the oscillator by shutting off its own synthesis in a regulated way, so it becomes self-sustained, autonomous.
Also, this prize is for physiology or medicine. So, what are the medical implications?
Well, there's a huge field of chronobiology, chronomedicine. It's really exploding. It's a fascinating area. But in humans, most data on specific diseases are so far correlations. So we don't really have the firm evidence to postulate that the circadian clock does this or that when it comes to disease. There are some examples. There are sleep phase disorders where you actually have mutations in the core, some of the core clock genes, and then you have a shorter or a longer phase, and that causes problems with sleep. That's a solid thing. But in humans, apart from that, there are lots of correlations. There's more known, of course, in animal models, where you can disrupt the clock and then see effects. Another example is jet lag, of course, but that's not really a disease. But that indicates that when we're misaligned, so our inner clock does not match or is misaligned to the environmental clock, then we really feel bad. But then, of course, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand if our lifestyle today with sort of a social jet lag has implications for disease. And that's very actively studied, but so far, mainly correlations.
Sometimes you feel kind of bad when in wintertime, when you're in Sweden and the darkness. How should one cope?
How one shall cope? Well, that's a big question. What I can say regarding that is that there's so many things that we need to understand, and also the core machinery, it's a lot more complex, but the concept is the same. But we now know that there are more factors regulating and stabilizing. There are interconnected loops, and there are mechanisms for entrainment, so you adjust the clock, mechanisms for synchronizing clocks throughout the body, and output mechanisms, so other genes are sort of hitchhiking on the system and controlled by the same mechanism. And all of this is really, really dynamic, and we are learning so much. So although all of these implication questions, what it means for our health, that really remains to be nailed down now. And they have provided tools for that. By understanding these mechanisms, we now have a way forward to address these issues.
And if we turn our attention to the laureates, who are they?
Well, they are 3 Americans. Michael Hall he was born in 1945. He worked very closely together with Mike Rosbash. They have been working together since the mid-70s, and they are about the same age. Rosbash is 1 year younger. Hall has retired, but Rosbash is very active still. And Michael Young, he's also an American, and he worked independently. They have also had some collaborations, but he's at Rockefeller University. He's also spent a very long career at Rockefeller, and he's still very active.
And finally, has the Nobel Committee been able to reach any of the laureates?
Yes, so our Secretary General, Professor Thomas Perlmann, he has reached Rosbash and Hall, but he's not been able to reach Michael Young yet.
And last question, what do you think is the best about this prize?
The best about it? Well, it's such a fundamental prize. It's a detailed molecular mechanism, but it explains how we are adapted to the planet. I think it's a very fundamental thing, and it's important for so many things, and it's opened so many questions and enabled so many questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, okay.